Probably the single most popular prophecy in the Bible is Daniel's 70 weeks. If you've ever studied this prophecy, if you've heard others teach it, you probably, like most people, are quite confused about it. In this video, we are going to demystify the 70 weeks of Daniel. I am Bible Scribe, and I am dedicated to bringing you simple and honest study of the Bible. I have studied a large body of works from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the early Christian writings. I am a technology professional, and I bring an analytical approach to the studies that we will do together. If you have been discouraged by the many voices telling you what the Bible says, stay tuned, because we will break through the noise and get to a plain understanding of the things of God, based on the Scriptures. Thank you for joining me in growing closer to Him. Let's get started. Hey guys, it is Bible Scribe. Thank you for joining me again. Daniel's 70 weeks. So, this is a pivotal prophecy in the Bible. It means so much when you understand it completely. But there's a lot of different views out there on this passage. And the passage we're talking about mainly is Daniel chapter 9, verses 20 through 27 is where this is contained. And I will admit, over my life, I've heard many different teachings about exactly what this passage means, what the time frame references are in it, who the people are mentioned in it. And there's just so much confusion. And honestly, we're going to find out as we go through this. I think you'll agree with me that part of it is due to translation issues. If you pick 5 different translations of the Bible, you're going to get 5 different impressions of what's going on in this text, because it is somewhat of a complicated text in terms of it's a future prophecy from when it was given. So we're all coming to it with expectations, trying to discern exactly what it was referring to and who and when. And so I think I have a good way to help us demystify this thing and look through it together. And I realize it's interesting, over the years that I've done this channel, I've never actually directly addressed the 70 weeks of Daniel. So I felt it was due time. So we're going to do that. And the way we're going to do that is by starting with the King James Version of the Scriptures. So let's go there. So Daniel 9, chapter 9, verses 20 through 27. We're going to read through the King James and then we'll move on. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time in the King James, but we're going to read through it because this is the way most of us have always heard this passage. In verse 20, and while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God, yea, while I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me about the time of the evening oblation. And he informed me and talked with me and said, Daniel, I am now come forth to give thee skill and understanding. At the beginning of thy supplications the commandment came forth, and I am come to show thee, for thou art greatly beloved. Therefore understand the matter and consider the vision. Verse 24. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. In verse 26, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. and the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured out upon the desolate. All right, now that's really the way we've always heard this passage, most of us. And of course, other versions have slightly different renderings, but all seem to breed a little confusion. And so what we're going to try to do next is take some of that confusion away. And the way I went about this, and the way I usually go about this, is I actually tend to retranslate. I retranslate it on my own. So just turning off my phone so we don't have to listen to that. So I'm going to show you a very literal and meaningful translation, and I'm taking into account with this translation 4 different sources. One is the original Hebrew from the Hebrew texts. One is the Apostolic Bible Polyglot, which is a Greek version that is built around many different ancient texts, including the Septuagint and a Latin version of it, and different other pre-Middle Ages texts. So it has a lot of research and a lot of different sources, and a number of sources talking in through it and in through the Greek in that version. And then I also used an interlinear Hebrew, so I can see word for word how the Hebrew is being constructed into the English. And then I can use, of course, Strong's and other resources for the meanings of Hebrew words. And then the last source I went to directly was the Septuagint. So using these 4 or 5 different sources, I am able to construct by the preponderance of evidence for what these words are meaning, I can construct a translation that's a lot more literal in a sense, but very close, as close as I can get to the original meanings of the words and phrases and structure being used in this passage. So that's what I've done here and what we're going to read through. And as we go through each verse and we read it in this very literal translation of mine, we will also talk about how that relates to and is different from the King James that we just read. So let's go ahead and start on that. So again, we'll start in verse 20. And here's how my translation reads. And while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before Yahweh my Elohim on the mountain of my holy Elohim. Now, this verse 20, being a very literal translation, I'm taking Hebrew words. So when he says, I was presenting my supplication before Yahweh, that is the Tetragrammaton in the Hebrew, but then it says, my Elohim. And in our translations, particularly King James, but most of our others, it says, instead of Elohim here, it says capital letter G, God. But the problem is, Elohim is it's not a proper noun or a name for God. It's not that at all. It doesn't identify the Father. It's a general term for a spirit being, essentially a high angelic being. And so here he's saying, I was presenting my supplication before Yahweh, my Elohim, because he knew, just as all of the Israelites did, the other nations, the Gentile nations, had their own Elohim. And of course, those were angels, and generally they were a shepherding type of prince or principality angel that ruled over those nations. And they were mostly going astray as far as what I've read and seen in the older texts and the pseudepigrapha. But he's talking, and this is Yahweh, my Elohim. And on the mountain, I was on the mountain of my holy Elohim, Yahweh. So it gives us a lot of context for, Daniel's perspective and these words. So you can see how I'm getting really, really literal and really driving at the understanding of these Hebrew terms and the correct interpretation of them into English. Verse 21, and while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen at the beginning of the vision, flew swiftly and reached me about the time of the evening offering. So just see there how, we'll go back real quick. And I want to read that in King James. And in King James, verse 21 sounds like this: Yea, while I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me about the time of the evening oblation. Do you see how when they translated it, it's totally not. It may have been very easy to digest in the King James vernacular at that time period, but in our time, that's not the way we talk. And so it makes the understanding of these verses very difficult. So you can see how I changed that to make it much easier to understand and more the way we would say these things without changing the meaning at all. So my rendering is, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen at the beginning of the vision, flew swiftly and reached me about the time of the evening offering. Okay, so that's really what it was saying, but it switches phrases around. So I'm doing that just to show you, how I went about this translation, because I really am meticulous when I do this, and I take it very seriously because, I'm not out here trying to say, David has the market corner on translation of the scriptures, but when I go to these old texts and I see things that apparently the King James translators didn't take into account. I mean, we have all the information. The information now for even the text that the King James translators use to do their version. We now have more ancient texts than they had access to when they did theirs. Do you realize that? We have all of the texts that they had, the copies, the different versions in Latin and and Greek, but we also have older texts that have now been discovered and found. So we can go a lot further back than they did, and they didn't have them accessible. They would have to travel to other cities to read different texts, whereas we have them all at our fingertips on the internet. It just makes for a very interesting time we're in where we have this information. So let's continue. I won't stop anymore to talk about that. Let's just keep going through the passage here. So we'll get to the 70 weeks shortly. Verse 22, and he taught me, Gabriel taught Daniel, and spoke with me and said, Daniel, now I have come to give you the ability to understand. Verse 23, at the beginning of your prayers the command went out, and I have come to tell you that you are greatly beloved. Therefore understand these things and consider the vision. Not really much to talk about there. He's just setting up this prophecy vision at this point. So now we're about to get into the 70 weeks. Verse 24. 77s are determined for your people and your holy city to finish the sin and to seal up the sins and to wipe out the lawlessness and to atone for iniquity and to bring in age-long righteousness and to seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the Holy of Holies. Now, this version is helping us understand a few things about the setup for this prophecy and about its purpose. So this is one of the more important verses, actually, of this prophecy, if you don't understand what is being said here. So starting out in the beginning of verse 24, let's focus on just this verse for a second. 77s are determined for your people and your holy city. All right? 77s, not 70 weeks. And that's why when, initially many people come to the passage, they see the word weeks, and then they hear someone tell them, oh, that means years. That means weeks of years. People think, that's strange. Why would it be that way? And most of us just kind of accept it and move on. We don't think much about it. But the word that is translated week in English, in most translations, is the word 7. It literally in the Hebrew it's the word Shabua. It says 77s. So it's not weeks as we think of them with days in each day of the week. It's 77s. And that's why when you consider this, the whole prophecy, you realize it's talking about years. That's the way it logically makes sense. Okay. It could be days, right? If we translated it and or interpreted it as days, but our timelines would be all off, and none of the prophecies that were said to have been fulfilled here would have been fulfilled. So we know it's not days. And then the other option is to make it some arbitrary, huge time period for each week, or seven. It's 700s of years or something like that. But none of that makes sense. So it truly does make sense as years. It's 77s of years. So that's total 490 years that this vision will take place. And that's determined, it says, for your people in your holy city to finish the sin and to seal up the sins and to wipe out the lawlessness, to atone for iniquity and bring in age-long righteousness. Now realize here that what it's saying, so this is giving us a clue of how to interpret the rest of the prophecy. It says that this 77s, this period of 70 weeks, is going to include the finishing of the sin of the people being Israel. So their sin is going to be complete and finished. It will be sealed up. And their lawlessness will be wiped out. Okay? Iniquity will be atoned for, and an age-long righteousness, an age of righteousness will be brought in. This isn't saying what the King James says. The King James says that this is everlasting righteousness, right? But that's not the right words. When you check the Septuagint in the Greek, it's the same word as aeon, the age. So this is really saying that what is being prophesied here is going to bring in the age of righteousness, which was known in Jewish prophecy already. They were currently in the Jewish age, and they were looking forward towards the age of righteousness, essentially the millennium age. So this really couches this prophecy in the time frame and context of what it means and where it's leading them into the age of righteousness of the Messiah. It says it's to seal up the vision and the prophecy, meaning this one that Daniel's getting, it's going to seal that vision and that prophecy, and it's going to anoint the Holy of Holies. Now, I think when I translated this, I wasn't thinking that many people, when they hear Holy of Holies, they're thinking the temple, but this is, it's literally in the Hebrew, it's the holiest of the holy ones, essentially. And so that's what it's talking about. It's talking about Jesus Christ. He's the holiest. He's the holiest of all holy people. And so that's what is meant there. It's not talking about the temple, Holy of Holies, the innermost court of the temple. It's talking about Jesus Christ himself, the holiest, holy one. All right, so that couches this prophecy in what it is intended to show. All sins of the Jewish people are going to be finished. They're going to be sealed up. Their lawlessness will be wiped out. And this vision and prophecy will be sealed up, and their sins will be atoned for, and the holiest one will be anointed. So that Jesus Christ anointed, an atonement for sin, and the end of all Jewish sin and lawlessness. All right? So that's it's telling us what's going to be in this prophecy. So move on to verse 25 here. And know and understand that from the proceeding of the command to answer and build Jerusalem until the Messiah the ruler, 7 sevens and 62 sevens, and the street and the wall will be restored and built, even in times of distress. So from the proceeding of the command to build Jerusalem, to answer and build Jerusalem, until Messiah the ruler, is going to be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. And we know from our history that there was a command to build Jerusalem by King Artaxerxes about, the exact number of years before Christ to match this prophecy. So that seems to be the command that was being prophesied right here. So that did go out. King Artaxerxes gave the command, and the construction began hundreds of years before Messiah. And note here what it says: 7 sevens and 62 sevens. So we have to understand, one of the things we need to recognize by the way this verse starts talking about these weeks or sevens of years is that it breaks them up into these chunks, right? So 7 sevens and 62 sevens. Why didn't it just say 7 and 62 sevens? Which is, I think, the way they would have naturally kind of. No, it breaks them up. So there must be some significance to the 7 sevens and then the 62. Altogether, that's 69 sevens. So this is saying that until, from the command to build the temple and restore Jerusalem, until Messiah came, or the Messiah, the ruler, was pronounced, etc., there were 69 weeks of years. So not 490, but 482 years. And there is a lot of work that has gone into finding out that that is exactly up to the time of Christ from the King Artaxerxes decree. All right. So I'm not going to go into that for this video. We're mainly focused on the text and what does the prophecy say. But you can do that on your own. It is, very conclusive that that's exactly what's going on here. Now, because our dating system is a little messy around the time of Christ when he was born in 0, and the Gregorian calendar shift and all this other stuff, it's hard to pinpoint whether this end of this 69 sevens, 69 weeks, ends at Jesus' crucifixion, or if it ends prior. I tend to think that it probably ends right at the moment when Jesus walked into the temple and they were waving the palm fronds and saying, "Hallelujah, hallelujah," because that was his pronouncement in front of the world as the ruler, the king of the Jews, or the king of everyone. And so that was the procession of the king, showing that he was who he said he was. And there is some scholars out there that do pinpoint it to that exact day. And they use all sorts of dates and mathematics to figure out that that is the right day. And that's typically what I have believed. It's not as, to me, not as important to know exactly what day and what year that was. And I truly don't know that we can, simply because of our dating issues with the Gregorian calendar and knowing time periods and things like that at that time. It's very hard. It's very hard to find the information you need to really make the conclusions. But it does seem to bring us right up to Jesus' ministry at some point. So that seems to be correct. And it says then, "And the street and the wall will be restored and built even in times of distress." Well, there was a lot of distress in this 482 years or 83 years between the command to rebuild and the Messiah. So there was all sorts of crazy stuff during that time period between the Testaments, the Old and New Testament. For instance, read the book of Maccabees and see what the Jews had to go through at that time. It was a lot of distress. Okay, we can move on now to the heart of this prophecy, verse 26. "And after the 62 sevens, the Messiah will be destroyed, with no judgment in him. And the city and the holy place will be brought to ruin by the people of the ruler who is to come. And they will be destroyed with a deluge, and to the end of the war desolations are determined." All right, now this should read a lot clearer than, for instance, the King James. And I really straightened out some of the grammar, because in Hebrew and Greek, the grammar is different. The way they phrase things, the order they put things, and that's why it made it so hard, I think, for the translators. They, generally a translation goes by certain rules, and so they set up the rules at the beginning of the translation, and then they don't deviate or try not to deviate from those rules as for the whole translation. So in the case of a very literal translation, sometimes they'll translate in a wooden literal sense. And so the word meanings are very accurate, but the phrasing is all weird because the way that Hebrew and Greek phrase the different passages we read is just not the way we say things. Just word orders are out of order, and so you have to know how to, fix that grammar as you go. And I think that this is a lot easier to read than the King James. But it says after the 62 sevens, remember it was first 7 sevens and then 62 sevens. So those two time periods now would be passed after the 62, which is essentially after 69 weeks, the Messiah would be destroyed. Now the King James reads cut off. Well, the cut off nomenclature and checking those other versions, it's essentially he's going to be killed, destroyed, okay? And there will be no judgment in him. Well, we know at the time that Jesus was crucified, he wasn't judging anybody. There was no judgment at that time. That came later in 70 AD when Christ was involved with God's judgment of Israel, and the temple and Jerusalem were just destroyed. But this is what it talks about next. It says, and the city, and this is after the 69 weeks, and the city and the holy place will be brought to ruin by the people of the ruler who is to come. Now, the ruler who is to come, remember this passage in chapter 9 is set right next to other visions that Daniel has gotten over the next 4 kingdoms that would be in place from his time to Christ. And the one that would be in place at the time of Christ was Rome. And so the 4th beast of Daniel in earlier passages is Rome itself. And so the ruler who is to come is the one who will bring to ruin the city and the holy place, the temple. So the ruler who is to come here is likely either Nero or Titus. And I need to go back. I'm not sure who ordered, I think it was Titus who ordered the destruction at the time of 70 AD. So I would imagine that this ruler here is talking about Titus of Rome. And it says, so it's saying the holy city and the city will be brought to ruin by the Romans. And they will be destroyed, meaning they who will be destroyed, meaning the Jews, they will be destroyed with a deluge. Well, the King James and many versions read flood. And so many people, when they read this passage, depending on their eschatology, they'll interpret that as all sorts of things, but they'll think that an actual water flood might be involved in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in this passage. But that's not what it's talking about. In fact, there's other places in the scriptures that use the word that is translated flood for a flood of armies or a flood of people, a deluge of soldiers will come upon the city. That's what it's talking about here. It's not a literal flood of water. It's using the more, broad term, deluge. And to the end of the war, desolations are determined. Now, this word desolations, people get all hung up on it because they're thinking abomination of desolation and stuff like that, which is going to be also something like that talked about in the next verse. But it's really not that. This desolations just means the ruination of something. It's going to be made useless. It's going to be made void. And so its original purpose will be taken away, essentially. Desolations are determined. Verse 27, and he will strengthen an agreement with many for 1 7. And after half of that 7, he shall cease the sacrifice and offering, and the temple will be an abomination of desolations. And until the time of the completion, there will be total desolation. So this is the passage in the King James that reads, and he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But you can see when you go to the original sources, you go to the original languages, it sounds more like this. And he will strengthen an agreement with many for 1 week. So the word covenant and agreement, and this is a lot of covenantalists really get sidetracked by this. The word covenant just means agreement. Sometimes they were signed, sometimes they were not. Sometimes they were sealed, sometimes they were not. A covenant and agreement, there's no other word in Hebrew. They used the same word for both things. So to pretend the word covenant in the scriptures means something more than an agreement or a contract is wrong. That's not the right way to interpret those words. So the passage here, and he, now another important thing here in this is he will strengthen an agreement with many. The word he is obviously a pronoun referring to someone prior. Now, when I used to study the King James and all these other versions, I always thought that he was the prince of the people of the prince who would come. I thought it was this prince, this, as many people think, this is like an antichrist figure. But we've already identified it's Titus in Rome. But if you identify that as an antichrist, you give it a lot of value, and then you see this pronoun he as you're studying, and you think, oh, that's the antichrist guy. It's the bad guy. The problem with that is that the last main subject in this passage in verse 26 was Messiah. This is Messiah, strengthening an agreement with many for 1/7, and after half of the 7, he will cease the sacrifices and offerings. So it's Christ that ceases the sacrifice and offerings in the middle of the 70th week, right? It's Christ that's going to do that. And it says the temple will be an abomination of desolations at that time. So he's going to cease the sacrifice and offerings. The temple will be an abomination. It will be desolate. Now, this is not some proper noun term, abomination of desolations, like people make it in many groups of Christians. It is simply saying it will be an abomination. The temple will be an abomination to God. It will be desolate. It will not be able to fill its function. It's useless. Desolation means useless, really. And so whatever the state, if it's burnt to the ground, which it was, if it's destroyed and it's rubble, which it was, it's desolate. It can't be used for its function any longer. And until the time of completion, there will be total desolation. So until this whole 70 weeks vision and the prophecy is completed, fulfilled, the temple will stay in desolation. It will be completely desolate, unusable. And we will see as we talk further about that that's the truth of what happened in history. So we have now gone through the 70 weeks prophecy in a very literal translation of mine according to the Hebrew, the Greek, the Apostolic Bible Polyglot, and the Septuagint. All these references, which I think are very good references and ways to get at the meanings of these words and how to construct these sentences properly. So doing that, I think we have a good picture. So we're going to talk about this. We've seen the word weeks is sevens. It's the word Shabua. So there were 77s in verse 24 mentioned. And in verse 25, there were 7 sevens mentioned, and then 62 sevens, and then 1 7. So there's these 3 denominations of sevens. So we need to think about that. And so how are these 77s put together by what we just read? So let me get my pencil out here and we'll kind of talk about that. So the way this thing does it, now there's different ways that people come at this text. And depending on what you already believe, you're going to color the vision you've been, that God brought us into. You're going to color your understanding of that vision based on what you already believe. So when I was brought up as a Baptist, and so I had a premillennial dispensational understanding of prophecy. And that really wasn't from the Bible. It was really from all the teachers I had growing up. I was in church all the time. And that's okay, but that's just how it is. And so here's what we're going to do. So the way that I learned this growing up is that first you have this section of 7 weeks. All right, 7 weeks. And then there was this larger section of 62 weeks. All right. So then I was taught, that, this being total 69 weeks, that this did end, like I said, at the time of Christ's ministry, perhaps when he walked into the temple that day in Jerusalem. But that then there was this huge prophetic gap. Huge. And it was literally 2,000 years, obviously, because, they said this 70th week, 1 week here, 70th, had not happened yet, right? So there must be this 2,000 year gap between the 69 weeks and what was going to happen according to them in the 70th week. And again, they believed that and taught me that this included the, Antichrist, and, it did include like the just abomination of desolation, and it included the temple abomination and destruction and all that stuff. But these things were all in the future mainly because I think they couldn't figure out what those things meant in the prophecy. And so because they see abomination of desolation and they think it's a proper term for something that was going to happen and that it was foreshadowed by Antiochus Epiphanes in the book of Maccabees, that is the type of thing where they spread pig's blood on the altar and desecrate it, and then somebody, the Antichrist particularly, sits on the altar or in the mercy seat in the temple or on the throne or something like that. It gets confusing because there's a lot of different interpretations in this type of belief system as far as what's going to all be included in that 70th week and what these terms we've already talked about mean. So this was essentially this is the premillennial, not always premillennial, but most premillennials believe this, but mostly the dispensational. Oh, man. Sometimes I mess up the writing and, just gotta get it fixed. Dispensational. So this is that view. And, when you really start to realize, like we've already mentioned, that a lot of the things referenced are generally misinterpreted. For instance, that he, meaning the Messiah, will strengthen an agreement for the last week of the 70. And then in the middle of that, will cut off sacrifices. He'll cut them off. He'll stop that from happening. When you realize that's Christ and not an antichrist that you can't figure out who it is, then you realize, wow, that's not some 2,000 years out or 3 or 4 or whatever in our future now, but that actually happened back then, all surrounding the time of 70 AD. And it makes complete sense that Daniel would be given a prophecy of that and how significant that was to the Jewish nation. It doesn't make any sense that Daniel, being a Jew, an Israelite, would have been given a prophecy for the Gentile church 2,000 or 3,000 years in the future. It wouldn't have made any sense to Daniel, for one, and it wouldn't have helped Daniel any. But a prophecy that spans the next few hundred years, that he could relate to the wise men of Judah and the Israelites and help them understand the next few hundred years of their future, their history, future. Now that would be important for them and for Daniel. So that is what makes the most sense. And then when we see that, this really does seem to fit perfectly with what happened at the time of Christ and his crucifixion and him being cut off and destroyed, just like it said. And then what happened with the temple that was desolate, it was made desolate in 70 AD. It was, the functions of the temple stopped. It makes perfect sense that the ruler that would come is Daniel's fourth beast. It's Rome's ruler, who then brings his armies into Jerusalem, like what exactly happened around 70 AD, and they wipe out the Jews, the wicked Jews. They cut off the lawlessness of the Jews. So that changes everything with how we understand and interpret this. Now, there's the next view I'm going to present to you is one that's not my view. It's still not my view, but it's really kind of it's one view of preterists, okay? It's one view that preterists often have and share, which I think is better than the previous view. But I'll show you why I don't think it's correct in just a minute. But this is the view. This is the 7 week period, the 7 sevens, and then the 62 sevens, right? Put them back up here, 62. And then they say, because we all kind of, when we realize that this is talking about the first century, we all reject that dispensational view of the huge gap, right? The huge, massive 2,000-year gap time period. So everyone who rejects that and realizes that was dumb, why did I ever believe that? They put the last week right up against the 62 and say, well, there must never be a gap. Right here. No gap, right? And so this being the 69, and then this is the 70th week, as we said. And so that finishes it out. And they'll say that, this 70th week is from, essentially, most of them say that it's from the start of Jesus' ministry running out of room, from the start of his ministry to it's about 3.5 years after his crucifixion. All right, they'll say that the 7 years was that time period from his start of his ministry, 3.5 years he was crucified, and then 3.5 years after that, and they'll usually pinpoint like a death of an apostle. And I don't remember which one, because I don't believe this is the correct view. Apostles' death. They'll say it's the death of Peter or Paul or one of these guys, and that they'll also explain that as the reason for that, the reason that's the end of the 70th week is because that's when the word had gone out to the Jewish nation. And so that ends the Jewish thing, right? Well, so we're going to talk about why I don't agree with that in a second. But just to show you this view, because a lot of people, once they reject the dispensational view, go to this view. The 7 weeks and the 62 makes the 69 up to the start of Jesus' ministry. And then that 70th week in the middle, right in the middle, is the crucifixion, right? And then the 3.5 years after that is the remaining time for the word to go out to the Jewish nation. And then, some apostle is killed. And then that's the end of the 70th week. But the problem is, well, there's a few problems. So now we're going to talk about the problems with this view, because I think that's important as people come away from dispensationalism and come into a mostly correct understanding, historical understanding of what happened in 70 AD, what Christ did when he went back to heaven after the ascension and prepared for this judgment against the Jewish nation in 70 AD. What all this means, you start to come to a different view, but then if you go to this view, you have some problems you have to deal with. So let's talk about those problems real quick. So we have to ask then, we have to analyze and say, could the 70th week be from Christ's ministry, the start of Christ's ministry, to 3.5 years after his ascension, right? Or his crucifixion, whichever. So one of the problems is that verse 26 says the Messiah would be cut off after the 62-week period, but it doesn't mention the 70th week there at all. So you'd think that if it was saying that Messiah was going to be cut off in the middle of the 70th week, that it would have mentioned that in the verse, I think it's verse 27, right? When it says that in the middle of the week, he would cause the sacrifices and oblations to stop, the temple function to stop, okay? So why wouldn't it instead say that in the middle of the 3.5, or the middle of the 70th week, that not only would the sacrifices and oblations stop, but Messiah would be cut off also? It doesn't do that. It says that there's the 7 sevens, and it mentions the 62 sevens. It says after the 62 sevens, Messiah is going to be destroyed. And it doesn't mention the 70th week until the next verse. Okay, so that's one, possible reason. Here's another. In verse 27, it says that in the middle of the 70th week, he causes the sacrifices and oblations to stop. So we have to ask ourselves, did the sacrifices and oblations stop when Christ was crucified? And the answer is going to be an overwhelming no. Nothing stopped when Christ was crucified, nor did any of the apostles teach it was. So did the apostles teach that the Jews were supposed to stop sacrificing after Jesus came? But they didn't. They didn't teach that at all. We have no record of them teaching to stop doing the Old Testament covenant. It was not a command to stop practicing their Judaism, their religion with God. It was taught that Jesus' commands were greater than the law, and that in fulfilling his commands, they were fulfilling the law if they so chose. That is what they taught. And then we have a record of Paul even keeping the feasts in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 18, verse 21. So this shows that after the ascension, Paul was still keeping the feasts. Nobody was teaching them to stop doing the things of the law. Nobody taught them that. They were only teaching that Christ was now a high priest in the book of Hebrews that was higher than any priest that had come before, and that following him and obeying him superseded the law. But they were never told to stop circumcising and to stop offering doves and to stop doing this and stop doing that. Nowhere do we see that kind of teaching from Jesus or the apostles. And then the Judaizers was a big issue after Christ ascended, and they were Jews who were trying to force the new Christians, Jewish and Gentile, to still fulfill all the law requirements of the Mosaic law. And what was the teaching against them? Don't tell the new Christians to do that. Don't tell the Gentiles to do that. But did they ever then turn it back on them and say, you shouldn't be doing that either? No, that was never taught. So the idea that Christ's crucifixion and resurrection had anything to do with the stopping of the temple practices is not evidenced anywhere. So if in the middle of the 70th week, Jesus caused the sacrifices and oblations to stop, then when did they stop? That would help us pinpoint this 70th week. Well, Josephus, in his Wars of the Jews, tells us that Eleazar ordered that they be stopped around 67 AD at the temple because they were preparing for the war with the Romans. So they knew that the Roman armies were gathering at this time, 67 AD, and so they were preparing, and Eleazar, who was the current high priest in the temple, told them, we're stopping all the dailies because we got to prepare for war. We got to batten down the hatches, right? And this at this time, the priesthood was also super corrupt. They were so corrupt, in fact, they could not even establish their successors any longer. And Josephus tells us that at some point before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, that the high priests were getting drawn by lots. They were passing out lots to all the priests and drawing them to see who the new high priest was going to be, because they couldn't establish the heritage any longer. It was just corrupt. They had no It was just bad. It was a bad situation. So now think about this. Does Eleazar ordering that the sacrifices in the temple stop mean that Jews everywhere didn't practice Judaism anymore? No, not really. So we have to ask ourselves, was possibly the destruction of the temple in 70 AD the true stop? Because once the temple was destroyed, think about this. Once the temple was destroyed, so was the practice of Jews everywhere. The temple was the cornerstone of their worship, the cornerstone of the Mosaic law. So once the temple was destroyed in 70 AD by God himself, not only could the priests not practice the sacrifices in the temple, but the law everywhere relied on the use of the temple. So the temple being destroyed meant that the sacrifices would never start again. This, I believe, was the true stop of the sacrifices when the temple was leveled and burnt to the ground by the Romans. And so, at that point, not only were the actual practices in the temple stopped, but Jews everywhere, because you read through the Levitical laws, everything centers around the temple. Everything. It's like if the temple's not there, then none of the sacrifices really matter, because they were supposed to be brought to the temple. The blood was supposed to be poured on the altar, the mercy seat, the Holy of Holies, all these different things. It was the representation of the heavenly things that they were supposed to honor. And when that fell, everything was done. Okay? So to me, this is the actual stop of the sacrifices. So here's the way that I kind of put this together. This is how I truly believe that this is. Just as we drew before, we have the different segments of the 70 weeks. And so we have the first 7 weeks, right? And then the 62 weeks. 62. Then here's what I believe. That this 62 led up to the start of Jesus' ministry. Essentially, I think it's when he came to the temple. But to be obscure, let's just say start of his ministry, whatever. It's when Jesus was recognized as the Messiah in Jerusalem. So I think that's what that was when he walked in the temple. Now, we know that these are our clues, right, from the passage, that Jesus would stop the sacrifices and oblations, and that the temple was going to be desolate at that time. And we read that in verse 27. It's desolate. Was the temple desolate any time during Jesus' ministry, or his crucifixion, or his resurrection, or the time afterwards? No, it was in use. It was being used, and that was the practices of the Jews. And neither did the apostles teach against that. They said, Jews, you're fine. Just accept that Christ is the Messiah that you've been waiting for all this time. And they never taught them to stop doing the circumcisions, or stop doing the offerings, or stop going to the feasts. In fact, Paul went to some of the feasts. So that, to me, cannot be the thing. His crucifixion cannot be the thing that stops the sacrifices. Jesus didn't teach it, neither did any of the apostles. So here's what I think. Here is the last week. This is the 70th week. Right there. And I do believe there is a gap. But it is not some massive gap. It's not some 2,000 years. This is a 40-year gap. Now, if you think about this, what significance would a 40-year time period have? A 40 years time period. Where else have we heard that? How long were the Israelites in the wilderness after they left in the Exodus, after they left Egypt? Before they came into what? The promised land, right? How long were they there? a period of trial, a period of testing. This is the wilderness for them. This is the wilderness for the Jews in the first century. It's a waiting period before the final entry into what? The promised land? Well, what is the promised land a representation of in the Exodus? It's over here. What was coming after all of this in the prophecies, in Revelation? What was coming after this? It's the 1,000-year millennium. So this was all leading up to exactly what all the Old Testament prophets were teaching the Jews. There was going to be a time of righteousness, the age of righteousness we read about in the beginning of Daniel. It was the age of the Messiah, the 1,000 years that was coming after God judged the Jews. And the millennial reign, as it talks about in Revelation 20, I believe 100%, as Christ taught, the kingdom was of heaven and the millennial reign was in heaven. The saints, meaning the ones who, the true Israelites who followed Christ in the first century, 144,000 of them, reigned on thrones during the next 1,000 years after that in heaven. Those thrones are not on earth. Those thrones are in heaven. Jesus is in heaven at the right hand of the Father. So this is truly what I believe happened, is that this gap was important. This was the trial and testing period before that final week where everything happened. So in the final week, what did happen? Let's put the final week right here. Final week. It's a breakout of this week over here. So in that final week, here's the middle. What happened in the middle? This was the temple was utterly desolated. It was destroyed. Temple was destroyed. What happened at the beginning of this final week? Well, this is about 67 AD, when, like Eleazar said in Josephus, he stopped the oblations and sacrifices in the temple for the priests because he said, we got to prepare for war. The Romans are coming against us. This is the start of the 70th week. And in here is what I think most of the texts are referencing, that is the tribulation. It's 3.5 years. In Revelation, it talks about 1,260 days. 3 a time times and half a time. This is the 3.5 year period. 3.5. 3.5. The temple's destroyed. So why would, you may ask yourself, what happens in the second half of this week? Why would it be way out in 70 AD? That's 70 AD. What happens after this? Well, if you read Josephus and you don't just stop at when the temple was destroyed, you know that the next 3.5 years, the Roman armies were chasing down all the remaining Jewish zealots. And they chased them all the way back up to the Jewish fortress of Masada. And that is what happened exactly 3.5 years later. The Jews there were slaughtered. I spelled it wrong, but you get the picture. And so that, it's just a perfect match. And what did the prophecy say that it was going to include? Do you remember what the prophecy said it was going to include? It was going to include and seal up all the sins of the Jews. Well, this certainly sealed up the sins and lawlessness of the Jews. Not only did God destroy their temple, but he had the Romans follow them up to their secret mountain lair in Masada and then have them all slaughtered. In fact, most of them at the end of the battle, they all killed themselves because they, not wanting the enemy to take them alive. But it's almost like God's hand was in that. This is a perfect match for this final week of the destruction in the middle of the week. Whatever remained of the old covenant was gone. No Jews even practiced at home the sacrifices anymore because the temple was gone. It was the foundation of their belief system. And it's hard for a lot of people to accept that there's the possibility of this gap between the 69 weeks and the 70th week. But I think that the dispensationalists actually had something right and that there was a gap, but it's not 2,000 years. I think the reason they use the 2,000, they think that it's a huge gap is because they still think some things haven't happened. But the reality is everything in Daniel's 70 weeks has happened. And just remember how it's mentioned in the passage. It's always mentioned in these segments of time, the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks and the 1 week, the 70th week. And so there's nothing in there that says they must start and be contiguous back to back. Nothing in there that says that. In fact, I don't know for sure that the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks are actually contiguous, like they bump up against each other. Perhaps there was something about the prophecy at that time that if we would understood there was a 7-year period, maybe during which the decree was going out and people were getting ready, and then the 62 while they were actually building. I don't know that for sure. I'm speculating. I'll be honest when I'm speculating, but I'm just saying it could have been something significant like that as to why Daniel was given this prophecy in these segments, 3 segments, 7, 62, and 1. But I do believe that there was this prophetic gap, and not that it's only significant in that it matches the Exodus perfectly. And it's the trying and testing and tribulation of the Jewish nation before their final judgment. They're given one last chance to come to Christ before that last 70th week, where all the horrible things, as far as the Jews were concerned, this was the end of everything for them. And then after that judgment, the promised land, which was the millennium they were waiting for, the reign of Christ in heaven for 1,000 years. Now, we won't talk about the fact that they didn't understand, most of the Jews at that time, that it was not a heavenly reign. They thought, or that it was a heavenly reign. They thought it was supposed to be an earthly reign. They wanted Christ to defeat the Romans. That's what they wanted. But they didn't understand that his defeat of the nations was not a physical defeat. He defeated the principalities of the nations. He put their authority down. And it didn't have anything to do with the Roman kingdom or all that stuff necessarily. So they were, of course, upset when their dreams of rulership over Rome, those dreams were dashed by Christ, because he's like, my kingdom's of heaven. It was different than they had hoped. But anyway, I think that explains the view very clearly, and I think that's all we'll do for today. Thank you for your time. I think it's interesting, to me it's interesting after you understand this prophecy very clearly. It's interesting to think about how you used to understand it and start to grapple with why you came to those conclusions and held them for so long. Because I think what I've presented here in this video is, if not exactly right, it's super close. Things definitely are not left out in the future for Daniel's 70 weeks. There's nothing left to occur in the 70 weeks. The 70 weeks were a prophecy given to Daniel for the Jews at that time, for him to pass down. And it was told to him in the end of the book to seal this vision up for the time. So he sealed it up for a specific time. It was probably a few hundred years until the seal was broken and the Jews read that prophecy, because it would have been closer to the time of Christ. If he had been told to seal it up for 3,000 years from now, there's no way. They would have lost it. It'd be gone, dust by then. So when you understand the reality of that this prophecy was real for Daniel, it meant something to the Jews, and it did prophesy the time of around Christ and the first century, that it made complete sense And it even makes sense why God would give them the 40-year waiting period before the final destruction so that they could come back, because that was their final judgment. So that as many as would come to him would do it, and as many as were wicked would fulfill their wickedness. God always seems to give provision for the wicked to fulfill their lawlessness, to complete their sin, which is exactly what the 70 weeks prophecy says was going to happen before the 70 weeks was complete. And so I truly think that's how it all went down. And praise be to God for, man, such an inspiring idea that these prophecies were perfect. And they perfectly explained what was coming. He perfectly told them what was going to happen. They had every opportunity. The Jews had every opportunity to come back to him. Some did, very few. But then thankfully he opened it up to all Gentiles. The grace of Christ and his kingdom is for everyone. And the Jewish nation was chosen because they were supposed to preach that to the world. That's what the purpose was, to show God to the world through the Jewish nation. And because they were wicked and didn't do that on their own, God did it through them by way of this judgment and this prophecy in 70 AD. He showed it to the world. Everyone in the world at that time knew what had happened in Jerusalem. And everyone, in fact, if you read the scholars of the time, everyone was saying that they felt like it was their God taking wrath on them, passing judgment on the Jewish nation because of their wickedness. Because honestly, from what I've read, not many people liked the Jewish nation at that time. There was a lot of corruption. The Pharisaical priesthood was not doing what it was not performing according to God's standards. It was performing according to men's standards. There were lots of alliances between the Jews, especially the wealthy Jews and the Romans, and they would, essentially sell out their own people and do horrible things. God gave them a time to complete that wickedness before he judged them, but he did judge them. This is a pivotal moment in history where he brought in the true kingdom of Christ and God, and that's what we are a part of. Until the end of the world, we're a part of that kingdom. We'll be a part of that kingdom forever, but for now we're waiting until he consummates the earth, and then we will all join him in heaven, either at our death or at that time if we live to it. So, that's what happened at that time. He established that kingdom that goes on forever in heaven. And it's so cool to just understand some of these things and be a part of it. But I hope this has been super informative for you guys. Try to make the notes and everything available on my blog. Like and subscribe. Post comments, or if you want to contact me directly, do it on my blog at bible-scribe.com and send me a contact form on that site. But I appreciate all you guys. God bless you and have a great day.